The evening started like any other family gathering. At least, that's how it seemed at first. Claire had been planning this dinner for days, weeks, probably. She'd mentioned it offhandedly at first, the kind of casual suggestion that always came from her when she wanted to make something feel effortless. But it wasn't effortless at all. I knew it. And, to be honest, I had a suspicion that the effort wasn't just going into the dinner itself. I'd been married to Claire for 6 years. Our relationship had seen its ups and downs, like any marriage, but we always came back to each other. We were solid. Or at least, that's what I thought. But tonight, something felt off. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the chaos of hosting a holiday dinner that was putting me on edge. The house was full of noise, laughter, chatter, the clinking of silverware. Claire's parents had arrived first, as usual. Her mother, Kathy, was the one overseeing the kitchen, as always, while her father, Greg, tried his best to hold court with my brother Nathan and the kids. Nathan had flown in from out of town, something he only did for major holidays. I could tell that Claire was thrilled to see him. Her eyes lit up when she greeted him, her posture softening in a way that I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't a huge thing, but there was something in the way she smiled. She hadn't smiled at me like that in a long time. Nathan was always the center of attention. I couldn't deny it. He had a way about him, a natural charm that made him the kind of person people wanted to be around. He was successful, well-spoken, charismatic, the kind of man who didn't need to try to be likable. He just was. And Claire had always admired him. She adored him, if I'm being honest. I had long since come to terms with the fact that Nathan was the golden child in our family, and I, as the younger brother, was left to play the supporting role. There was no bitterness, really. I respected him. But there was always a feeling of comparison, of knowing that no matter how much I tried, I couldn't quite match up to Nathan in Claire's eyes. Tonight, however, it wasn't just Nathan's usual effortless charisma that was standing out. It was something different. Something that I couldn't place my finger on, but that gnawed at the back of my mind the longer I watched them. The evening went on, and everything appeared normal. We ate, we drank, we laughed at Greg's corny jokes. But something in the way Claire and Nathan interacted felt different, like an invisible thread connecting them that I couldn't see but could feel tugging at the air. There were glances exchanged across the table, small, fleeting moments that no one else would have noticed. But I noticed. I always noticed when it came to Claire. I had spent years getting to know the subtleties of her expressions, the small changes in her body language, the way her voice shifted when she was nervous or excited. Tonight, her laughter was louder, more strained, as if she was trying too hard to keep the atmosphere light. But it wasn't just her. Nathan seemed different, too. There was something in his eyes when he looked at her, something that wasn't quite right. It was the same look he had given her when they had said goodbye at the airport months ago, a quiet moment between the two of them that lingered a bit too long. At the time, I had chalked it up to the usual affection between siblings, but now, as I observed them more closely, that moment replayed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The evening wore on, and I did my best to shake off the unease building in my chest. I didn't want to overthink it. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Just my own insecurities manifesting after spending too much time alone in my own head. Claire and Nathan were close, closer than most siblings, but that was normal. Or at least, that's what I had always convinced myself. Still, as the evening progressed, the small things started to add up. The way Nathan's hand brushed against Claire's when she passed him the bread, the way she leaned just a little too close to him when she spoke, the way they shared that private laugh when no one else was looking. It all seemed innocent. Maybe it was innocent. But the more I watched, the more it felt like something was slipping out of place, something I couldn't put my finger on. My stomach tightened with a knot of discomfort. Maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe I was imagining things. But I couldn't ignore the tension between them, the quiet undercurrent of something unspoken, something that seemed to buzz just beneath the surface. At some point, I excused myself to the bathroom, needing a moment to clear my head. As I walked down the hallway, I heard them talking quietly in the kitchen, just Claire and Nathan. The conversation was too muffled for me to make out, but the way they were speaking, soft, intimate, like the rest of the world didn't exist around them, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stood there for a moment, listening, frozen in place, wondering if I should just walk in. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I turned back toward the living room and pretended like nothing was happening. But deep down, I knew something was. When I returned to the dinner table, the odd sensation of being on the outside of something I couldn't understand refused to leave. Nathan had a way of talking to Claire, a way of pulling her into his orbit without anyone else noticing. He was smooth, unassuming. But I saw it. And Claire, she didn't pull away. She didn't seem to notice it. No, if anything, she leaned into it. Her eyes sparkled with something that wasn't there when she looked at me. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I was being paranoid. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more I realized it wasn't just in my head. It was real. And it wasn't something I could ignore. The dinner finally came to a close, and everyone began to leave. But as I stood by the door, bidding my farewell to Claire's family, my mind kept racing, replaying those moments, wondering if I had been blind all along. Something was wrong. Something had shifted. But what? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to learn something I wasn't ready to hear. And that knowledge was a weight I couldn't quite lift off my chest. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I even tried. The second I lay down, the images of Claire and Nathan lingered in my mind, uninvited and stubborn, like shadows I couldn't outrun. Every little detail, every glance, every whisper between them, it all replayed in my head in a loop. I turned over and over in bed, but sleep never came. The clock on the nightstand ticked loudly, as if mocking me. 2 a.m. 3 a.m. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. I had stopped counting the hours since I last closed my eyes. Around 4 o'clock, I gave up trying to force sleep. I got out of bed, slipped into a pair of sweatpants, and went downstairs. The house was eerily quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound that filled the empty space. I stepped into the kitchen, hoping a glass of water would settle my mind, but instead, I found myself staring blankly at the coffee machine. Coffee? It was too early for that. But then again, I wasn't sure it was ever the right time for what was swirling inside my head. It wasn't just the way Nathan and Claire had looked at each other. It wasn't just their whispered conversation. It wasn't even the fleeting touch or the intimate laugh they shared. No, it was everything, the weight of it all, that I couldn't ignore. The sudden realization that something had shifted between us, that Claire wasn't the woman I thought I knew. Or maybe it was that I had never known her at all. How could I have missed it? How long had this been going on? Were these signs I'd overlooked? Or had I just been blind, trusting my wife and my brother too much? I didn't know what to believe anymore. I kept replaying the events of the night, over and over again, but each time I did, the gnawing feeling in my gut only grew stronger. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a certainty. And that certainty brought a wave of panic with it. I knew I had to talk to Claire, but I wasn't sure how to approach her. Should I confront her directly? Or should I wait and gather more information? There was no way I could ignore what I had witnessed, and yet, something told me I was on the brink of something I couldn't take back. Once the truth was out, it would change everything between us. When I heard the front door open, I flinched. I hadn't expected Claire to be up yet. But there she was, stepping into the kitchen in the same loose sweater and leggings she had worn to the dinner. Her hair was slightly mussed from sleep, and she looked tired, more tired than I had seen her in a long time. For a brief moment, I felt guilty, as though I were the one who had caused the storm that was brewing between us. "James," she asked quietly, rubbing her eyes as she stepped further into the room. "What are you doing up?" I hesitated before responding, unsure if I should tell her the truth. Was I about to unravel something that couldn't be undone? "Couldn't sleep," I said, trying to sound casual. She nodded, but I could tell she was more alert now, her eyes sharp despite the sleepiness in her voice. She studied me for a moment, but I didn't return her gaze. "I couldn't." "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft, laced with concern. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to reassure her that everything was fine. But the lie wouldn't come. Not this time. "I'm fine," I said, the words sounding hollow even to me. There was no way she could believe that. "Claire, can we talk?" Her expression shifted instantly. Her brow furrowed, and she took a cautious step toward me. "Of course. What's on your mind?" I swallowed hard, feeling the pressure build in my chest. Every part of me wanted to avoid the question I had to ask. But I couldn't hold it in any longer. Not with the weight of it pressing down on me. I need to ask you something, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. And I need you to be honest with me. About Nathan. She stiffened, just a little, but I noticed it immediately. A shift. A subtle movement in her posture that made my heart race. The guilt crept up her neck like an invisible tide, and in that moment I knew. She already knew what I was about to ask. "What about Nathan?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't lie to me, Claire," I said, my voice more strained than I intended. "There's something going on between you two, isn't there?" Her face paled slightly, and I saw the way her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. She didn't look at me right away. She stared at her hands, clasped tightly in front of her. She was silent for a long moment, and the silence was 1,000 times worse than any answer she could have given me. I knew she was avoiding my gaze. And in that avoidance, I saw the truth. It was there, plain as day, but she wouldn't say it. Not yet. Finally, she met my eyes. Her expression had softened, but there was no hiding the truth anymore. "James," she started, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I never planned it. But it did. It's been going on for a while." I felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath me. My knees felt weak, and I had to lean against the counter to steady myself. My mouth went dry, and my mind screamed in disbelief. But I knew better than to pretend I didn't hear her. "Since when?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, as though I couldn't even say the words aloud. 6 months, she replied softly. Her eyes were filled with something I couldn't place, guilt, regret, maybe fear. But there was no denying the truth of what she had just confessed. 6 months, I repeated. The words felt like they were suffocating me. "How long were you planning on hiding this from me?" "I never meant to hurt you, James. I never wanted this. But it happened. And now, I don't know how to fix it," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. I stared at her for a long time, unable to find the words that might make any sense of this. I had no idea what was real anymore. All the years we'd spent together, the promises we had made, the life we had built, it was slipping through my fingers like sand. The woman I thought I knew wasn't the woman standing in front of me anymore. She was someone else. And Nathan was involved. My own brother. The words Claire spoke hung in the air like an invisible weight, pressing down on both of us. 6 months. That was how long this had been going on, how long my wife had been hiding the secret, how long she and Nathan had been involved in something that completely shattered the trust one had built my life around. I stood there, numb. My mind was racing, a whirlwind of emotions that I couldn't even begin to process. Anger, betrayal, confusion. All of it came crashing down at once, a wave I wasn't ready for. My body felt heavy, like I was sinking into the floor, unable to breathe. And yet, there she was, standing in front of me, eyes brimming with tears, a look of helplessness on her face. "I didn't want to hurt you, James," she repeated, her voice trembling. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand every single answer. But I couldn't find my voice." It was as though the floodgates had opened, and all the emotions I had buried for years were pouring out, leaving me paralyzed. The world around me felt distant, like I was living inside some strange, disconnected bubble. I began, but the words caught in my throat. It felt like there was a fire inside me, but I couldn't get it out. How could I even begin to make sense of this? How could I confront the person I had trusted most in the world and not feel like I was being torn apart from the inside out? Claire reached out tentatively, her hand hovering just above mine, but I pulled away, unable to let her touch me. "Please," she begged softly. "Say something. Anything." I wanted to say something, anything, but my mind was a blank canvas. What was there left to say? 6 months. 6 months of lies, deceit, and hidden moments between the two people I had loved most in the world. And now, I stood there, trying to figure out how I could ever look at either of them the same way again. "I need to know everything," I finally said, my voice hoarse, barely audible. "How did this even happen, Claire? How?" She bit her lip, looking down at the floor. "It wasn't planned, James. It wasn't like we decided it would happen. It just, she paused, searching for the right words, but there were no words that could make this situation right. It just did. We were close. And one thing led to another. Close. I echoed, my voice rising in disbelief. You were close, Claire? You're telling me that my brother was just someone you were close to? For 6 months. She flinched, as though my words physically hurt her. It's not like that, she whispered, shaking her head. It wasn't a game. It wasn't about sex or anything like that. It was, I don't know, emotional. He listened to me. He understood me in a way I thought I could never find again. The anger that had been simmering deep inside me boiled over. So, that's it. You just found someone who understood you? After everything we've been through together, you went to Nathan for comfort. My fists clenched at my sides, and I had to fight the urge to scream, to let the frustration spill out in a way that might tear everything apart. No, Claire said quickly, shaking her head. It wasn't like that. It wasn't just about needing someone to talk to. It was deeper than that. I don't know. I'm so sorry, James. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could control it. But I couldn't. Her voice cracked, and I saw the guilt written all over her face, the pain in her eyes. But it didn't change the fact that what she had done was unforgivable. Or was it? Could I ever forgive her? I didn't know. So, how long has it been going on? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air like a looming cloud. I told you, 6 months, she said softly. I didn't want to keep it from you, but I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to tell you. How long did you think you could hide this from me, Claire? How long did you think you could keep this a secret? She didn't answer. Her silence said it all. She had been living in the shadow of her own guilt, carrying this weight every day, knowing that one day I would find out. But I hadn't expected it to be like this. I hadn't expected the woman I loved to be capable of something so deliberate. I need to see him, I said suddenly, the words escaping my mouth before I could stop them. What? Claire asked, looking up at me in shock. I need to see Nathan, I repeated, the anger in my chest building again. I need to hear it from him. I need him to explain this. To explain why he thought this was okay. James, please, Claire said, her voice breaking. Don't do that. Please. It's not his fault. He didn't. No, I said, cutting her off. It's his fault just as much as it's yours. You didn't do this alone, Claire. Don't try to protect him. I turned and walked toward the door, but Claire grabbed my arm. James, please don't do anything rash. I'm begging you. But it was too late. I had already made up my mind. I didn't care about the consequences anymore. I had to know why. Why had they done this to me? Why had they chosen to betray everything we had built together? Stay here, I said, my voice colder than I intended. I'll be back. And with that, I left. I didn't know where I was going at first, but my feet seemed to carry me on their own, driven by a force I couldn't control. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was disbelief, confusion, and a desperate need for answers. I had been married to Claire for 6 years, and in a matter of minutes, everything I thought I knew had shattered. The foundation of my life, my home, my relationship, my trust in the people closest to me, was crumbling, and I couldn't stop it. I found Nathan's apartment after what felt like an eternity of walking in a haze, my mind replaying the conversations, the glances, the little things I had missed. When I knocked on his door, it felt like a drumbeat in my chest. The sound reverberated in my bones, loud and painful. I wasn't sure what I would do when I saw him, whether I'd scream, demand answers, or just stand there in stunned silence. But there was only one thing I was sure of. I needed to hear it from him. The door swung open, and there he stood, Nathan, my older brother. His hair was still wet from a shower, his shirt loose and untucked. He didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, his eyes held an emotion I couldn't place, something that seemed to recognize the weight of what had been brewing for days. But there was no guilt. Not in the way Claire had shown. Instead, there was something else, a strange calmness, as if he had already made peace with the choices he had made. James, he said quietly, his tone neutral, almost too calm. "What's going on?" I didn't say anything right away. I just stood there, staring at him. My mind was racing, but my throat felt tight, as if the words were stuck behind a dam that I couldn't break. Finally, I found my voice. "Don't play dumb with me, Nathan," I spat, the words coming out harsh, edged with a bitterness I hadn't realized I was capable of. "I know what's been going on between you and Claire." The tension between us thickened instantly. Nathan's eyes flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. He was caught. He knew exactly what I was talking about. His expression didn't change, though. He didn't flinch. He didn't seem surprised at all. In fact, it was almost like he had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for me to find out. "Come inside," Nathan said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the living room. "We need to talk." I didn't want to go in. I didn't want to be near him, near the man who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. But I had no choice. I followed him into the apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the soft glow of the television. Nathan sat on the couch and motioned for me to take a seat across from him. But I didn't. I stood there, pacing back and forth in front of him, my mind whirling. "You don't have to do this, James," Nathan said, his voice still too calm. He didn't seem angry, not at all. In fact, he sounded almost detached. "You know how this goes. You've been married to her for years, and you've seen the way she's been struggling. We've all seen it." I froze. "Struggling?" I echoed, the word like a slap to my face. "You're telling me this is some kind of excuse for what you've done? For what you've both done?" Nathan's expression shifted slightly, but it was subtle, almost imperceptible. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not saying it's an excuse, James. I'm saying that sometimes things happen that you can't control. You think Claire's the only one who's been struggling? I've been dealing with my own shit for years. But I'm not blaming you for it." I wanted to say something back, something sharp, something that would cut through his rationalizations. But I couldn't. There was no defending this. There was no excuse for what they had done, for the way they had betrayed me. The thought of them together, my own wife and my brother, felt like a knife twisting in my gut. "Why?" I finally managed to ask, my voice breaking slightly. "Why Claire? Why my wife, Nathan?" Nathan's face softened, though there was no apology in his eyes. "It wasn't planned. Not at first. It just happened. She needed someone, and I needed someone, too. It didn't start with the physical stuff. It started with talking. With understanding each other in a way we hadn't before. And once you get to that point, once you let your guard down—" "Don't," I interrupted, my voice rising. "Don't you dare try to make this sound like some kind of connection, Nathan. You betrayed me. You both betrayed me." "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Nathan said, his tone finally showing a hint of emotion. "But it wasn't guilt. It wasn't regret. It was resignation. But it did. And I'm sorry for the pain it's caused. I really am." His words were hollow, like he was reading from a script, reciting an apology that didn't hold any real meaning. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry he'd been caught. "You're sorry?" I scoffed, shaking my head. "You don't get to be sorry now, Nathan. You don't get to apologize after the fact, after you've ruined everything." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back on the couch, his eyes flicking briefly to the floor. There was a long pause before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had lost all of its previous calmness, replaced with something that almost sounded like frustration. "You think I wanted this?" he asked, looking up at me. "You think I wanted to hurt you? I didn't. But things aren't always as simple as you think they are. Claire and we connected, James. In a way that neither of us expected. You don't just turn that off." "You're not answering the question," I said, my fists clenched at my sides. "Why her? Why my wife, Nathan?" He met my gaze, his expression now unreadable. "Because we both needed something the other could give us," he said softly. "And when you're in a marriage like yours, sometimes it's easy to forget what you're missing." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it made a sick sort of sense. Was I really that blind? Was I so wrapped up in my own world that I hadn't noticed Claire's unhappiness? Had I been so sure of my own relationship that I failed to see the cracks forming? "I'm done talking about this," I said suddenly, turning on my heel and heading for the door. "I don't need to hear any more of your excuses, Nathan. I don't need to hear you justify what you did. You're both dead to me." I slammed the door behind me, the sound echoing through the hallway. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay in that apartment for another second. As I stepped out into the cold night, I finally let the rage take hold. But there was something else, too. A deep, gnawing sadness that I couldn't shake. My brother. My wife. They had both betrayed me in a way that I couldn't even begin to understand. And now, the real question was, where did I go from here? I didn't go home right away. Instead, I walked aimlessly through the streets, letting the cold night air sting my face, as though I could somehow numb the pain, or at least delay the inevitable. The anger still burned inside me, but beneath it, there was something worse, something deeper. A hollow ache that had settled in my chest, the kind of emptiness that comes with losing something you thought you could never lose. Nathan's words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over again like an insistent drumbeat. We both needed something the other could give us. I couldn't stop hearing it, couldn't stop the images it conjured up, images of Claire and Nathan, together, laughing, talking, finding solace in each other. The thought twisted in my gut, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. It was one thing to have your world shattered by betrayal, but it was another thing entirely to have that betrayal come from the two people you trusted most. I had always thought of Nathan as my brother, someone I could rely on, someone who would have my back no matter what. And Claire, she was my wife, the person I had promised to spend my life with. We had built a life together. And now, that life had been reduced to dust. As I stood on the street corner, my eyes finally fell on the glowing light of a coffee shop across the road. It was late, but the place was still open, likely for the late-night crowd or the few people like me who were running away from their own thoughts. The warmth from the shop was a welcome distraction, a temporary reprieve from the coldness of the world around me. I walked in and sat at a corner booth, my hands shaking slightly as I wrapped them around the warm mug of coffee they set in front of me. It wasn't the warmth I needed, it was the distance, the silence. I needed to be alone, to think, to process. I didn't want to face Claire again, didn't want to look her in the eye and see the guilt written all over her face. Not yet. I glanced at my phone, but there were no messages, no calls. No surprise there. Claire hadn't tried to reach me after I left. She knew I needed space. She knew I couldn't face her just yet. Maybe she was giving me time to cool off, or maybe she was waiting for me to come to terms with the truth. But I couldn't do that. I couldn't just accept this, accept that my brother and my wife had been lying to me for 6 months, that they had betrayed me in the most unimaginable way. I spent the next hour in the coffee shop, staring at the empty space in front of me, not really seeing anything. My mind wandered, but it kept returning to the same place, my relationship with Claire. The past 6 years. Our plans, our dreams, our future together. It all felt so distant now, like a story I had once told myself that had been rewritten in a moment of betrayal. I tried to picture the life we had built together. The times we laughed, the times we argued, the small moments of connection that I had cherished. But now, those memories were tainted. The good times were overshadowed by the betrayal that hung over everything. What did I do now? How could I even begin to pick up the pieces of a life that had been torn apart? By the time I left the coffee shop, the world had shifted. It wasn't just the betrayal anymore. It was the loss. The loss of trust. The loss of a future that no longer felt possible. It wasn't just about Claire or Nathan anymore. It was about me, about who I was now in the wake of everything that had happened. I returned to the house. The door was unlocked, as it always was. But tonight, it felt different, like a threshold I didn't want to cross. I could already feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. I could hear Claire moving around upstairs, likely trying to keep herself busy, keep her mind off everything. But I wasn't ready to face her yet. Not when the truth was still sitting between us, unspoken. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, my mind racing with a million thoughts, none of them making any sense. I wasn't even sure what I was supposed to be doing anymore. I wasn't sure what I wanted from this, from Claire, from myself. And then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Nathan. "James, please. Let's talk. I know you're angry, and I don't blame you. But this isn't going to fix itself. You need to hear the rest of it." I stared at the screen for a long time, the words burning into my mind. What else was there to say? Hadn't he already said enough? Hadn't he already explained himself in a way that made it clear there was no going back? But something inside me, the part of me that still clung to the hope that we could fix this, made me tap the message open. "What's left to say, Nathan?" I typed, my fingers moving quickly over the keys, despite the turmoil that churned inside me. The response came almost immediately. "Please. Just meet me tomorrow. I'm not asking for forgiveness, James. But you deserve to know the whole truth." I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity. Was this the answer I needed? Was this the closure I had been hoping for? But something in me, something deep down, knew that even after hearing everything Nathan had to say, nothing would ever be the same. There was no going back to what we had before. Still, I had to know. I had to hear him out. As much as I hated it, I needed the full truth. Even if it meant facing the one person I had trusted the most in the world, the person who had shattered everything in a single careless act. I quickly typed back, "Fine. Tomorrow. I'll hear you out. But I'm not promising anything after that." I hit send and dropped the phone onto the counter, feeling an empty ache in my chest. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But I knew one thing for sure: it wouldn't be the same. And neither would I. The hours leading up to my meeting with Nathan felt endless. I barely slept, my mind buzzing with anger, confusion, and something worse, a growing sense of helplessness. I had tried to bury it, but the thought kept creeping up. No matter how angry I was, no matter how badly I wanted to cut ties with him, the truth was that Nathan was still my brother. And that truth made everything more complicated. I stood in front of the coffee shop, the familiar red and white sign glowing warmly in the morning light. The street was quieter than usual, still too early for the usual crowds. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to sit down and listen to Nathan's excuses or explanations. But I had no choice. He'd made sure of that when he sent me that message last night. When I walked inside, Nathan was already there. As always, he had his coffee cup in front of him, but this time his eyes weren't on the drink. He was watching me closely, like he was waiting for me to explode. I didn't feel like exploding. I just felt numb. I sat down across from him, keeping my eyes focused on the table in front of me rather than on him. The space between us felt colder than I expected. The silence stretched on, and for a moment, neither of us knew where to start. "I'm here, Nathan," I said, breaking the silence. "Let's get this over with." He nodded, his face tense, almost reluctant. "I don't expect you to forgive me, James. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I owe you the truth." I nodded, my throat tight. I had heard enough half-truths and evasions over the last 24 hours. "Then tell me everything. No more excuses. Just the truth." Nathan sighed and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together like he was preparing for something difficult. His eyes shifted, clearly unsure of where to begin. But then, his voice was steady, almost too steady, as he started to speak. "You've always been a big part of my life, James. Always been the older brother who took care of everything. And I've always looked up to you. But for a long time now, I've felt like I've been living in your shadow. I never felt like I could measure up. And Claire was the one person who made me feel seen. She didn't expect anything from me, didn't need me to be anything I wasn't. She listened. She understood. And when I was feeling lost, she was the only one who could talk to me. She was the only one who made me feel like I wasn't invisible." I blinked at him, my heart racing as the weight of his words settled in. I knew it wasn't just about Claire anymore. This was about Nathan's deep-seated insecurities, his need for validation, for someone to give him the attention he felt he hadn't gotten. It was more than an affair. It was his way of trying to fix a part of himself that was broken. "None of that matters now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to keep my emotions in check. What matters is that you betrayed me, Nathan. You betrayed both of us." He flinched, his face hardening for a brief moment before he looked down, ashamed. "I know. I know I did. But I didn't set out to hurt you. I wasn't looking for this. I wasn't looking for her, and I wasn't looking for trouble. It just happened." The words stung more than I expected. I didn't know if it was his tone, the vulnerability in his voice, or the deep sadness in his eyes, but something about the way he said it made it sound like it wasn't as simple as he was making it. Like there was more to it. I needed to know everything. "I don't understand," I said, leaning forward. "How did it happen? How did it go from you and Claire talking to whatever this is? You've been lying to me for months." Nathan's gaze dropped, and for a moment I thought he might not answer. But then he spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost regretful. "It started with one conversation. Just one. We were at your house, and you were busy with something. I don't remember what. But Claire and I were alone, and she started talking to me about how you two had been drifting apart. She said you weren't the same person anymore. That you were distant. And I didn't know what to say, James. I didn't know how to help her. But I didn't leave. I stayed and listened. I gave her something you couldn't." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I didn't let it show. It wasn't the time to let emotions take over. He was still talking. And then, we started spending more time together. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't planned. But the more I heard her out, the more I started to think maybe she needed something I could give her, someone who understood her the way she needed to be understood. But that was the problem, James. I was looking for something in her that I should have been looking for in myself. I didn't know it at the time, but I was using her just like she was using me. I felt sick. Part of me wanted to get up and walk away. I wanted to leave, but I needed to know everything. I needed him to finish. "Did you ever think about what I would feel?" I asked, my voice low, but the anger in it still simmering. "Did you ever stop and think about how all of this would destroy me?" He didn't look at me. He couldn't. I didn't think about it, no. I was too busy focusing on my own need to be needed, too busy with the way she made me feel. But the truth is, I didn't expect to care. I didn't expect to fall for her. But I did. And that's what's even worse. I fell in love with her. The words hit me like a physical blow. It was one thing to hear about an affair, to hear about lying and betrayal. But to hear him say that, to hear him admit that he was in love with her, made everything I thought I knew about him shatter completely. I sat there, numb, not sure what to say. What could I say to that? The truth was so much worse than I had imagined. Nathan had crossed a line I could never come back from. And the worst part was that it wasn't just about sex or a moment of weakness. It was about love. It was about something that could never be undone. "You both need to leave," I said, finally, the words coming out more coldly than I intended. "I can't be around you anymore. Not like this. Not after everything." Nathan's face fell, but there was nothing he could say. He knew it was over. "I understand," he whispered. "I'm sorry, James. I truly am. For everything." I stood up, my body rigid with the weight of everything I had just heard. There was no catharsis, no release. Just the crushing weight of realization. I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, feeling the weight of my life shift irreparably. Nothing would ever be the same. Not with Nathan. Not with Claire. Not with me.